Welcome back to the channel. If you follow the news, you're going to see that the protests in China over Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy continue to escalate. They've now spread to multiple cities. They include what looks like thousands or tens of thousands of people. And they are protesting the zero COVID philosophy. That's a philosophy that says that this highly contagious respiratory virus can be extinguished or kept at bay if we just did the right things. China, of course, has been able to do things as a totalitarian dictatorship that other nations have not been, including literally welding people into their homes, having mandatory quarantines, taking away children from parents, all sorts of draconian totalitarian actions to try to quell the epidemic. They have failed. The cases continue to rise. And the people are fed up with 3 years of this policy. Now, I have to say, China, in many regards, actually can do a lot of things better than democratic nations. Their infrastructure can develop at a rapid pace. All they need are a few central decision makers to validate something, and they can move full steam ahead. But that power is also a liability when you all get behind a deranged philosophy, and that is the case of zero COVID. Zero COVID was always a stupid idea. And here's the key. China latched on to zero COVID, and they took it to its logical conclusion, which is something that anybody who believes in freedom should be offended by. But there were experts in the United States who wanted the Chinese response, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. There are a number of people now who are tweeting that we should praise the protesters in China, that they're doing a very brave thing. And I absolutely agree, they're doing something very brave. But the challenge with that is that the same people were those who argued that we ought to have zero COVID policies in the United States and Great Britain. These are the same people who said we just needed a hard lockdown. We needed a circuit breaker to stop the virus. These people are not good scientists. They never were. They never will be. The flaw in their reasoning was that we don't know the full impact of these measures. They have clearly off-target effects. Those effects span all domains of life, including children, people seeking medical care, all sorts of spillover effects. And we don't even know that they leave us better off. We don't even know that they have effects beyond voluntary behavioral change. What do I mean by that? During the COVID-19 pandemic, the more you talk about the spread of the virus, people are going to naturally make behavioral changes. They're going to be less likely to go out when they hear things are terrible. When they hear the hospitals are overflowing, they're going to make a lot of voluntary changes. The question is always, is draconian governmental policy having a delta effect on those voluntary changes? And is that delta sufficient to justify the loss of freedom? And I think different people can disagree. Some people may say that there is no amount of lives saved that will justify any loss of freedom. There are other people who may be more centrist who say it's possible you could justify loss of freedom under certain circumstances, but they'd have to be really overwhelming benefits. But I think what we see is that we have taken away freedoms and we didn't get much in return for it. We didn't have commensurate benefits. There have been many very limited observational studies of these topics, but few of them have really probed the question the way I think it will ultimately be probed by pairing cell phone tracking data with the implementation of these rules. China, of course, is a different story. China, they have the ability to have profound regulation from the top down, stopping all commerce, all traffic, all movement in cities. And they have been able to keep the virus at bay more than other nations. They have made one rookie mistake, which is that they didn't vaccinate elderly people with a good vaccine. I don't understand why they're choosing to do that. That would have been cheap and easy for them to do. But they've also made the mistake that you can't squeeze people the way they have done year over year. Even in a totalitarian regime, people will eventually push back. To some degree, I'm glad we live in America. Despite all of the challenges in America, I think that were it not for the fact that we had two very different and rival political parties, it might have been very easy for parts of this country to have slipped into totalitarianism and that sort of draconian top-down restrictions first sort of approach. Thankfully, we have parts of this country that would have always resisted that. And that's actually a strength of America. Actually, it turns out, in different situations, it might be the other way around. But there is a group of people out here in America who I think believe strongly in a sense of freedom and liberty. And I think I agree with them, that they were probably right in the sense that I'm not sure what we gained from lockdowns. And I'm certainly worried about the potential for abuse and misuse. Already, I see signs of that in America. I see some people who say that if a town or a region has a lot of RSV or flu, that they should lock down or they should go back to masking or any of these other things. That to me is crazy. It's going to be clearly a recipe for misuse. Let's talk about masking. Masking, in my opinion, is not the same as welding someone in their house. I want to say that off the bat. It's also not nothing. It is something that people have mandated. And in my opinion, public health has a obligation, a scientific and a moral obligation, to justify its mandates with cluster randomized controlled trials. You got to prove that the mandate actually makes people live longer or live better lives. Public health failed to do that. It failed to do that in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Switzerland, in France, in Italy. It failed to run any cluster randomized trials in Western, high-income, developed nations across the globe. They ran one trial called DanMask. It was a shitty trial. It's a shitty trial when you power your trial for a 50% reduction in SARS-CoV-2 and you have a 2% baseline rate. That's a shitty study. It doesn't have adequate power. And it's also not a cluster study, so you're only testing sort of a one-way use of the mask. Let me clarify this. If you do an individual randomized controlled trial of masking, you're only really studying whether or not I wearing the mask protects me. In order to study the claim as to whether or not mask mandates slow the spread of virus in a community, you would need to randomize communities, and that is called a cluster randomized design. We did do one cluster randomized control trial. It was done by a few people who were economists in Bangladesh, and I commend them for doing that because that's better than not doing it. But they did a lot of things that were pretty stupid. One is they went to rural Bangladesh, not urban Bangladesh, so they have no generalizability to urban centers. Two is that they went at a time pre-vaccine and pre-natural immunity, so they're really getting, at most, I think, the upper bound effect size of masking. And then the other big problem of the study is that they probably had a concealment bias issue. There's a discrepancy in the number of people who participated in the study in villages where they were randomized to masking, and that's higher than the people who participated in the study in the villages that were not. That suggests that people in the villages knew what they were going to get, and that's a big problem. Because if you know which arm you're going to be randomized to, you have inserted a key bias in a randomized study, and that bias is so great that no amount of post hoc sensitivity analysis can correct for that bias. That is a deep flaw in the study, and in my opinion, that makes the modest and perhaps marginal results of Bangladesh actually meaningless, and certainly meaningless in a world that we have vaccines. I think mandating vaccines is another misuse of government power in the absence of doing studies that prove its value. Once you prove the value, doesn't mean you can do it. It means you can have a discussion with the populace as to whether or not the benefit is worth the downsides. But without doing the study, you are not practicing science. You're practicing witchcraft. I mean, you're a religion. And in fact, the fact that it's so paired with political preference, to me, is deranged. I mean, you know the people who are still wearing N95 masks probably overwhelmingly voted for Biden. That's not good that you know their political preferences. That's really not good. Back to China. Some of the people commenting right now who are applauding the protesters in China were the same people that wanted us to lock down harder. They were the same people who said we should use the National Guard to enforce lockdowns. They were the same people who went on Twitter and said when they went into a Home Depot, somebody was walking around without the mask and the staff of the Home Depot did not confront the individual. They wanted more confrontation, more brute force applied to their vision of zero COVID. They were always deranged, and now we see what would have happened had we listened to them, which is we would have gotten China. We might have not have gotten it as long, but we certainly would have gotten a flavor of it. This is the policy that they wanted, the zero COVID zealots. They didn't get it, thank God, because we've got a lot of people in this country who believe, I think, in sort of a more historic and canonical definition of freedom. They didn't get it. They couldn't get it. They could never get it, I think, thank God, in this country. But now they're saying that they never really wanted it. They never really advocated for it, and that what China is doing is wrong. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They're not telling the truth about what they actually said back in the day. I remember, and people have receipts, and they've been tweeting receipts all day. Receipt after somebody saying the exact opposite a few years ago. It's really concerning. The current pandemic response was out of step with all pre-pandemic guidance, all pre-pandemic documents, which said under only the most absolute horrendous conditions close schools. Those conditions were never actually met. We closed schools prematurely and for too long. All of this was done, I think, mostly due to irrational fear. That's one chunk. The media cannibalizing fear. Another chunk is that whatever Donald Trump did, we wanted to do the opposite of because we're the smart people. But it's not smart just to do the opposite of him, especially on a few issues where he was right, like schools. And then I think another part of it was the sheer hubris of people that we can control Mother Nature. And people still have that hubris. It's the hubris that I encountered recently when I saw somebody wearing an N95 in a 200-degree Fahrenheit sauna. They have the hubris that they can avoid the virus by wearing this N95. In a condition that it's never been validated for. In fact, you know where else N95s haven't been validated for? The surface of Mars, okay? You can't wear this product in a 200-degree Fahrenheit sauna and think it's going to do anything. It's not been validated for what will happen when you start pouring sweat into it. It's not been validated for those temperatures. And it's also kind of crazy that you would even do such a thing. You got to choose. Do you want to go in the public sauna? In this case, it was a gym, but you have to have a membership. You want to go in a place that's communal, or do you want to stay in your house for the rest of your life? You can't have it both ways. And in fact, I suspect that with the amount of sweat that anyone would be pouring out in that sauna, this stupid intervention is not going to be doing anything. China shows what happens when you have centralized decision-making. Its potential can be great. I mean, they've built more rail tracks than anyone, and they've moved into high-speed rail unlike anybody. I mean, more than anybody, better than anybody. But when you have the wrong vision and the wrong idea like zero COVID, you can make the most foolish decisions. And even a population subject to dictatorship and totalitarian rule can only take so much. You can only squeeze the balloon so much. And now we see people rising up. I think it's important to remember that many of the experts now who wanted this in this country, that's what they called for. They are now trying to back away from those proclamations. I never wanted it. In fact, I always wrote from the very beginning, we should listen to experts with diverse points of view and not demonize them. That's my stat piece from April 2020, because I always knew you ought to have this dialogue. And when I saw what they did to John Ioannidis and others who were critical of the current pandemic response, I felt offended and scared that we weren't going to have that dialogue. And in fact, that's what happened. The only thing that prevented them from going further, of course, is that they would have run up against, I think, the strong resistance of a huge chunk of this country. And that resistance, I think, is more formidable than what could ever be achieved in China, just due to some bits of history. I'll leave it at that. So, those are my thoughts. China, lockdown, terrible. The people now praising the protesters, hypocrites. And the right answer was, I think, what was the right answer? Okay. It was not dissimilar from GBD, Great Barrington Declaration. Okay, but I didn't sign that. And, people know I don't sign that. I didn't sign that. Why didn't I sign that? Because I think the thing that was missing from GBD were the proactive things we could be doing. We could have actually tried to do what public health is supposed to do, which is public health is supposed to offer you things that help you make the choice that's right for you. So by that I mean different mechanisms to provide, well, one, I think schools should have mostly been open. They could have closed temporarily for 4 weeks, but then when we saw that it was safe, they could reopen. Then we needed to create programs that allowed people whose kids were sick to drop their kids off and be able to go to work. I think we needed to encourage people going back to work even early, some sort of staggered shifts, some sort of, we could take some precautions and we could space out the office a little bit and try to do that. I think we could have also been more fair about vaccination, provided exemptions for natural immunity, encouraged people to do it, provided more incentives to do it in the older population. We could have forgotten about younger people. We didn't have to chase this one-size-fits-all solution. We could have vaccinated the right people. And then the moment after you've offered vaccination for a few months, you got to just let society get back to normal. Let people get back to normal. I would have always avoided using the police state as a mechanism for public health. I think you have to use incentives and provide funding, but don't ever use the police. You don't want the police to be synonymous with public health. And I think we have to also give credit to Americans that voluntary behavioral change was likely 90% of the lift. We'll find out more in the decades to come when people study it. But it was a huge portion of what had actually happened. And the more and then I think you should have run many, many cluster randomized trials of masking, of distancing, to try to figure out what works or not pre-vaccine. And post-vaccine, I think you have to accept the fact you've done the only thing you can do to lower risk, and we got to get back to normal any way around it. The mistakes, I think, were predominantly made, I would have to say, by the Biden administration, because they didn't push enough for normalcy thereafter. They kept schools closed for far too long. They had the vaccine. They didn't deploy it in the right way. They prioritized essential workers. No offense to essential workers, but a 20-year-old resident should not be getting it over an 85-year-old. That was a stupid decision. It was always stupid. I thought it at the time. I think I said it at the time. And so there are a number of points along this path we could have done better. Schools should have been reopened. In fact, we should have had more childcare opportunities for people. And I think you really, in the future, should never use the police state. I think you can only offer incentives. You can only be positive. You can't really be negative. Not when you're playing the public health game. And that was why I disagree a little bit with GBD, because they didn't have all those things in there. I mean, I certainly agree with them that schools shouldn't have closed. I agree with them. You should have focused on the high-risk subgroups. I think their philosophy was far more correct than Jon Snow memorandum. I think they were unfairly demonized. I think they were prescient in many ways. I think they're thoughtful and fair scientists. I don't think they were motivated by perverse interests. So I liked a lot of them, and I'm, have talked to them in the months since. As a progressive, I thought we could have had more sort of programs to try to facilitate some of these things. And I think that's the best you can do. And you also have to remember that don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The perfect in the minds of the zealots is China right now. But that's not good, actually. Sometimes perfection is not the enemy of the good. It's actually the worst thing imaginable. So those are my thoughts on this space broadly, thoughts on where we made a mistake. It really does sicken me to see people, such hypocrites, now cheering the protesters when they, in fact, wanted the China response. They begged for it. Luckily, they didn't get it. They didn't get it because of the opposition. And those people continue to play a pronounced role in media, in Twitter, in politics. And I think we still have a reckoning to be had. And then ultimately, my biggest objection is to the anti-evidence-based zealots, the people out there who think you don't need randomized trials of masking. These people are, I think, totally wrong. Not just wrong, they are actually a threat to science. They're not scientists, and they're a threat to science because their delusional views keep us from making progress and will leave this pandemic, I think, in many ways just as ignorant as we entered, and that is not good. So if you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. Until next time.